Good evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome to our event here this evening, and that's co-sponsored by the Centre for Irish Studies and the Department of Political Science. It's wonderful to see so many people here, and you're all very welcome. Apologies for those of you who didn't get a seat. The talk, I should say, will be on the Villanova University YouTube channel also, but it was more popular than we had even anticipated. My name, for any of you that don't know me, is Sarah Murta. I'm new faculty here in the Centre for Irish Studies and the Department of Political Science. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Marco Biaggi, for this extremely timely talk on Britain, Ireland and Brexit, the view from Edinburgh. So it's wonderful to see so many of you here and see so many students, some of my own students, in Irish politics and politics of divided societies. I know there are students here from British politics, amongst other courses, as well as colleagues from across the university and members of the community as well. And I think this reflects, of course, the very pressing and immediate nature of this topic, and also its very wide-ranging and serious implications, not just for Britain and Ireland and Scotland and other parts of the UK, but also its wider geopolitical significance. We're here against the backdrop of a constitutional crisis in the UK. We've seen unprecedented events unfold in the last couple of weeks at Westminster. And the consequences of this crisis for Ireland are very clear and have dominated the news internationally, given the pivotal position of the Irish border in the negotiations and in the current impasse. So we're all aware of the very serious potential political, economic and social implications, and the very real risks to peace and security on the island of Ireland. Indeed, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel was today visiting the border in Ireland and referred to the matter as one of war and peace. And although it's received less attention in the international media, Brexit, of course, also has enormous implications for Scotland. Scotland, like Northern Ireland, voted to remain within the European Union in the referendum in June 2016. And as in Northern Ireland, it's radically shifted the parameters of politics there, in terms of the outlook for not just for the economy, but for democracy and Scotland's constitutional future. The politics of Ireland and Scotland have historically been closely intertwined in more ways, I think, than are always obvious. And likewise, I think their fates in the Brexit negotiations and beyond are going to remain closely linked and closely tied. So luckily for us, Marco is here to speak to us about this today and has bravely agreed to talk to this topic tonight. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him here to Villanova. I know Marco since 2007. We met when we were both working as researchers in the Scottish Parliament for members of the Scottish National Party. And I have to say then that I did not expect to be one day introducing him in a US university as a former Scottish minister who was going to talk about the UK leaving the European Union. But there you go. Marco is very uniquely placed to speak to this topic, given his background and his experience. He's had an extremely interesting and accomplished career to date. After working as a researcher and a pollster in the Scottish Parliament, he stepped into frontline politics in 2011 when he got elected to the Scottish Parliament. During that time, he was made government minister, Minister for Local Government and Community Empowerment in 2014 at the age of just 32. And it's fair to say that his time in office was a pretty eventful one for Scottish politics. In 2014, we had the Scottish referendum, the referendum on Scottish independence, and then 2 years later, the referendum on the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. Marco was deeply involved in both campaigns. He stepped down from politics in 2016 and decided to pursue a PhD in political science here in the US at Yale University. But he's kept a hand firmly in Scottish politics and works as a consultant for an Edinburgh-based firm. So I'm very grateful to him for coming to speak to us this evening about this topic. And he's kindly agreed to hold a discussion afterwards, so there'll be time for questions. I'd like to also sincerely thank all those who supported the event this evening and made it possible, the Centre for Irish Studies, Professor Joseph Lennon, and a special thanks to Dr. Jennifer Joyce and Kirsten Ludi for all of their work in organising the event. And also a big thanks to the Department of Political Science also. I will hand over now to Marco. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you for that kind introduction. Introductions like that always remind me that I have a great future behind me. And thank you all for turning out in such great numbers. When Sarah and I were plotting when to do this, we thought this would be a really good week because Brexit should have happened on Friday, and this would be a retrospective. As it is, it seems to be more a commentary on events that are still unfolding, and I've actually had to spend most of the day checking my phone to make sure I wasn't being overtaken by events. This has been the problem for all journalists and all commentators on Brexit, including myself, when I wrote a book chapter only between submitting and it being published to find that the SNP government called a referendum, the UK government refused the referendum, and the UK government held a general election. So in terms of having been overtaken by events, the small events of today fade into insignificance. And one other point before I begin, do not adjust your set, do not adjust your hearing. This is a Scottish accent and an Italian name. It can throw people. It occasionally throws students. I will every so often get an email entirely in Italian, and frankly, that just embarrasses both of us. I am a third generation Scots-Italian. I have about a teaspoon of Italian blood in me. However, I may, through diaspora politics, be eligible for an Italian passport, should it come to that in another couple of weeks. So, Britain, Ireland, and Brexit. There's a lot I want to cover, a lot I want to squeeze in, and I'm also very conscious I've got to provide enough knowledge for people that maybe are coming with nothing, while also providing some insights for those people that have been following it like addicts as it has been going on. So, where are we? Well, we had a referendum. The UK voted to leave. We then had an early election that was supposed to solidify the Conservative government. They lost their majority and required the Democratic Unionists in Northern Ireland thereafter. And then, early this year, repeated attempts to get a negotiated withdrawal deal have been voted down in the UK Parliament. The Irish backstop and issues of customs union chief amongst the problems. More of this later. But the question that sometimes gets asked is, well, what's in that space up there? What happened to make this come about? And you can pick many starting points, but a really important one was back in October 2011, when there was a cross-party rebellion of MPs from both main parties in the UK Parliament demanding that there should be an EU referendum. It was the expression of pressure that had built up over many, many years. But we've had the vote. We've got two pro-Brexit parties in government. We've got an opposition that has largely reconciled itself to Brexit. What is the problem? Well, this is a very popular Twitter account right now, the Irish Border, a personification, an anthropomorphization of the Irish border. And this sums it up. It is the elephant in the room in the negotiations. It has prevented any kind of deal emerging that satisfies all of the players in this particular negotiation. And just to move on to illustrate the second part of that, the perception of Ireland in the UK, I have another tweet that went quite viral during the World Cup. That's the Soccer World Cup, sorry, an American audience. And it was basically an Irish person complaining that she was assumed to be supporting England in the World Cup. And if you can't see the bottom line, her final reply is that she unrolls a wall map, she extends a pointer and says, we begin with the Norman invasion of 1169, page 4 of your handouts. And it is actually quite hard to imagine and properly understand the whole mess that is happening on the islands without going a little bit back. Now, you might want to say, well, maybe not quite as far back as 1169. Well, sorry to say, we're going back to the 6th century. Right, so Scotland and Ireland. Scotland and Ireland are separated by a sea. Anybody who's flown over it and who has taken the boat and has given an entire day to that journey knows how much of an advantage the plane is. But back in ye olden times, the sea was like the highway. And back and forth between Scotland and Ireland, there was tremendous cultural interchange. The word Scot comes from a Roman term for the inhabitants of Ireland that eventually straddled the North Channel between the two countries. And according to tradition, the founding king of Scotland, Kenneth MacAlpin there, became the king of Scots when he united the Pictish kingdom of the northeast and an Irish kingdom in the southwest, Dalriada. And that is where Scotland's history begins to count from. When you look as well at the significant changes, significant events, the introduction of Christianity to Scotland came from Ireland, not overland from England. And there's been a constant interchange back and forward. In 1315, Scotland's national hero, Robert Bruce, decided to put his little brother on the throne of Ireland. Now, I'm a little brother. My big brothers have never given me a country. I think they're pretty much in a dereliction of duty there. But that attempt didn't end well for the Scots. A few centuries later, Protestant Scots settled in Ulster, and to be honest, that didn't end well for Ireland. In fact, the repercussions of that are still felt today. Indeed, if there's an issue that caused Scotland and Ireland to diverge after thousands of years of being almost inseparable, it was religion. Scotland embraced the Protestant Reformation in a way that Ireland did not. And as a result, Scotland began to draw much more close to England. Over time, Scotland threw itself into the empire, whereas Ireland threw itself against the empire. Scotland was a participant in imperialism. Ireland was very much a victim of imperialism. But in the 19th century, there was again another significant migration when Irish people moved to Scotland to find work in industrialization that was going on. Today, Catholicism in Scotland, this is from the 2011 census, is an indicator of where those people settled, primarily in and around Glasgow. And that is a cultural impact that is still felt today. In case anyone's interested, the Western Isles here were not a great target for Irish immigration. It was just simply that they were so remote that the Reformation never made it there. So they never actually converted to Protestantism in the first place. But this had led to a great difference between Scotland and Ireland. Sectarian tension began to appear in Scotland. This is just from last year, but you can see arguments over public funding of Catholic education back in Scotland in the 1920s, 1930s, and it has been a scar on Scottish society, not to the same extent of causing problems as in Northern Ireland, but it has been, in many respects, Northern Ireland in miniature. But this led to a difference in nationalism. In Ireland, nationalism overlapped with religion, language. In Scotland, it overlapped with neither. And so nationalism in Scotland took a lot longer to come along. When it came along, oil provided its base. This is an actual Scottish National Party poster from the 1980s on the It's Scotland's Oil campaign that ran through the 70s and 80s as Scottish nationalism really gained momentum. This is a vampiric representation of Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, suggesting that she was sucking the oil from Scotland in much the same way as a vampire would suck your blood. The 80s were not noted for subtle political metaphors or imagery, and neither were the SNP. But where does Ireland come back into this issue, and where does this connection come? Well, it's Scotland's oil got the cause of Scottish independence so far. But in the 90s, a new party leader, Alex Salmond, who would later become the first nationalist First Minister of Scotland, adopted a policy of independence in Europe. And this was a real breakpoint for Scotland and Scottish politics, because two of the main parties began to be very supportive of the European Union. Independence began to be mentioned in terms of the European Union. It was no longer isolation, it was a family that could welcome Scotland. And by no coincidence, I'm not sure this is going to be terribly clear, Ireland was beginning to show what a small country of a few million people could get from the European Union. And Scotland moved from being very distant from Ireland, being very unwilling to make parallels with Ireland because of the sectarian history, to beginning to argue that this Celtic Tiger was something to emulate. Now, the numbers aren't going to be visible, but the blue lines here are Ireland's economy per person, the green, the UK's per person. And in the late 90s or early 2000s, depending on which measure you use, Ireland overtook the former colonial master. And this was an absolute vindication to the SNP, to the independence movement, of what you could do with independence in Europe. This was the basis of argument after argument for years. The term that was really used was the arc of prosperity. There were all of these countries, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, that were similar to Scotland in many ways, that had achieved much greater economic progress than Scotland, or indeed the UK. But the arc of prosperity was a hostage to fortune, and when the financial crisis hit, it became the arc of insolvency to the opponents of Scottish independence. And I think there is a counterfactual where, without a financial crisis, Scotland voted for independence. But Scotland didn't vote for independence in 2014 and remained in the Union. But one of the things that was said then was, you will save Scotland's membership. There was a tweet put out by the official No campaign saying, how do you end Scottish membership of the EU? You vote for independence. Well, people didn't vote for independence, and it appears that membership has ended. Now, how did Brexit come about? Let's move on. The thing that really surprises me is how many people were surprised. Polling in the run-up to the referendum showed a very noticeable narrowing. But despite that, no one in the pundit class could believe that the UK was going to actually vote to leave the European Union. But the signs were there. There had been growing Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party. In the 90s, there had been a small handful of backbench rebels. It got up to 81 members. And if you look at any social indicators for Europe, for European identity in the UK was always at the bottom or near the bottom. So its turnout in European elections was bottom or no higher than third bottom in any election. Its participation in the civil service in Brussels was the lowest per head. Its participation in Erasmus, the student exchange system, was the lowest per head. Conversational knowledge of other European languages were the lowest per head. The government had secured opt-outs from the euro, from free movement across borders, through Schengen, from ever closer union, from justice and home affairs, from so much over the years. And then the actual proportion of people in the UK willing to describe themselves as European, given a list and asked to pick something, not in competition. It wasn't a case of being asked, are you European or English, European or British? It's just, How many of the following apply to you? Never went higher than 10% in the election studies. And on top of that, 4 of the largest newspapers, British newspapers, print the most slanted partisan coverage. They take an ideology and they run with it. The broadcast news is neutral. The print media all take slants. It's kind of like the opposite of Fox News and the newspapers over here. The Sun, the Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, between them, millions circulating every day took avowedly hostile stances during the referendum. It's no wonder the polls closed, and it's no wonder that we got the result we did. Blue areas voted to remain. Red areas voted to leave, and the darkness of the colour indicates by how much. 2 things should be obvious. The nationalist areas along the border in Ireland voted to remain by considerable margins. Scotland voted to remain by considerable margins. London, the most cosmopolitan part of the UK by any measure you choose to name, voted to remain in the European Union. A few other islands exist, largely of well-to-do areas or university towns. Academics will be asking classes of students for decades to come an essay question that is, were economic or cultural factors more important in deciding the Brexit vote of 2016? I can safely predict that right now. I can't answer it because people have divided into 2 camps. Goodwin, Norris, one side, and Jennings and various others in the UK on the other. It is a live debate where people are fighting each other with big regression tables. But it's fairly clear that the areas, even if you don't go down into individual motivation, that voted to leave are more likely to be economically depressed areas or areas with a lot of very traditional conservative voters. And in that respect, it might be a coalition quite familiar to Americans as the evolving modern coalition of the Republican Party that combines working class people in areas that feel like they have been disadvantaged by economic change with wealthy business elites. And if you actually ask the voters themselves why they voted the way they did, this is from the British election study, you get some very interesting results. So any idea what you think the Leave voters would say? Sorry, I'm going into teaching mode here. But yeah, like if there's one word to stick out in Leave, what do you think it is? Well, yep, got it. So sovereignty was an issue. Sovereignty was a big issue. But immigration, the fusing of immigration and sovereignty was the coalition that helped Leave. Remain, on the other hand, were more concerned about the economy. The Leavers, on the other hand, said that, in the words of Michael Gove, the public have had enough of experts. They're going to go with their heart. And why not Scotland and Northern Ireland? Well, there's this fantastic paper, if you've got time to look it up. It sets out a theoretical framework for voting in all European elections, and it all European referenda, at least until 2005. And despite being written 11 years before the Brexit vote, it was a very good model for it. Essentially, people will vote based on calculation, whether they're going to be better off, community, do they feel any sense of gut connection, and cues, what do people they trust tell them to do? And in Scotland, all the cues were vote Remain. Everybody said, all the parties were saying vote Remain, even the Scottish Conservative Party. Community was weaker. Most voters identified as Scottish. And European identity was actually no higher in Scotland than it was in the rest of the UK. And in calculation, it's hard to draw any conclusion. My argument in a paper I've written is that the Scottish vote was actually very, very fragile and was based on the fact that people supported parties that argued for Remain rather than any kind of gut connection to Scotland, to the European Union. Northern Ireland, well, similar in cues, except for the DUP. Remain correlates with Irish nationalism. Broadly, there's a lot of support still. There was a lot of support nonetheless amongst unionism, but clearly it had Leave had a 2-to-1 advantage there. But if you contrast this with England, the difference is huge. One other important thing here that's important for Ireland is that national identity in Northern Ireland and Scotland, in the UK as a whole, is a very contested issue. So in Scotland, traditionally you ask people if they are Scottish, British, or some combination thereof. In Northern Ireland, it's Irish, British, and in England, it's English British. But there are two faces of Britishness. In Northern Ireland and Scotland, people who identified as British were more likely to be leavers. They were identifying with what you might call the dominant identity, the socially dominant identity, the conservative identity. In England, those who identified as British were more likely to be Remain. And it's very curious that in England, Britishness means something very cosmopolitan, and in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it tends to be associated more with much more conservative values. And then there's been a vote. Scotland's had its vote. Northern Ireland's had its vote. Both failed to go with the majority. And this is where we are now. Yeah, negotiating Brexit. If you look back on what was being said back at the time of the referendum, there were all of these hostages to fortune, these statements like, we vote to leave, we'll have all the cards, the countries will be queuing up to make trade deals with the UK. Now all of these quotes are being projected onto walls or being put on billboards by a crowd-funded campaign called Led by Donkeys. I really advise you to follow it on Twitter. But again, thinking about concepts and some of the bigger lessons of this, not just for Britain, but understanding Britain and the EU. I'm going to draw on some literature to suggest that there are two important concepts here for federalism and confederalism that this whole situation is highlighting. One is the idea of self-rule. So the Scottish Parliament has certain powers in Scotland. The Irish government has great amounts of power in Ireland, but both are restricted slightly in what they can do based on the wider constitutional framework. If you're familiar with American federalism, the UK's federalism is a little bit different. So if you think about a minimum wage in America, a minimum wage might be set by a city, it might be set by a state, it might be set by the federal government. In the UK, the practice is a bit different. Each power is put at one level, and that one level can legislate for it. So a minimum wage can be set by the UK government and only the UK government, whereas the things that are taught in school can be set by the Scottish government, but not the UK government. So it's actually created a sort of parastatal situation where the Scottish government in Edinburgh is actually responsible for many of the duties of a modern state, the health service, the education, transport, criminal justice, environment, and much of tax. But that's the concept of self-rule. And although nationalists like myself are always eager to point out how restricted Scotland is, we actually score pretty highly. We're alongside American states, Canadian provinces, German Länder now. And of course, an actual member state of the EU as a sovereign state scores even more highly. But there's a second concept, and that is shared rule. And this is where the Brexit situation has really shown one of the deficiencies of Britain. And that is the amount to which the territorial units get a say in the collective decisions affecting the whole. So think about the vote since Brexit, the negotiation process. The EU has put Ireland's interests at the front of their negotiating position. They are not going to sell out Ireland. They have made this clear many times. They have insisted on an Irish backstop because of Irish objections to any deal that disadvantages them, that creates a hard border in Ireland. It is an absolute textbook case of an example of shared rule, strong shared rule, where every member of the European Union as a confederation gets a say. Now, I'm a Scottish nationalist. I will say this, wouldn't I? The UK is totally the opposite. The Scottish National Party proposed a mechanism in the referendum whereby, as well as the vote requiring a majority of all voting, it would need to get a majority of the vote in a majority of the 4 territories, i.e. 3 of the 4. This is quite familiar to anybody who's familiar with federations. If you want to do a constitutional change in the US, you need 38 states to ratify it. This was considered to be ridiculous by the UK establishment. The UK still thinks, when it comes to central decision making, like a unitary state. But if there is one change, it is that Ireland and Scotland have drawn quite politically close. Enda Kenny spoke up for the Scottish government in the first negotiations after the vote. And the Scottish government has opened something that it is constitutionally not allowed to call an embassy in Dublin, but which very much is serving that function. So, why is Ireland so concerned? Well, there's the hard border, again, to get to, but there's also the economic cost. When you look at the EU, all of the EU stands to lose if there's a no-deal situation, if there is no withdrawal agreement, if it's a disorderly withdrawal with border controls going up overnight. But Ireland stands to lose proportionally almost as much as the UK. Ireland and the UK have tremendous level of trade connections, intermingling of movement, even some administrative functions. And all of that stands to risk. So no wonder Leo Varadkar has been meeting Angela Merkel today, and he met Macron on Tuesday, Macron being the one who is most militant at trying to force the UK government to concede or suffer a no deal. There are other analyses of this that give different numbers, but they all give the same rank order, with the UK at the top, Ireland second, and then the rest of the EU thereafter. So, why has this been such a problem? Like, couldn't they all just get together and agree something? You ask voters today in the UK, they really, really wish that MPs could just get together. But this is a slide that was produced by Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator for the EU. And essentially, the UK entered with a series of red lines, and every red line takes it a little bit further away from a future relationship. So the UK government doesn't want to accept the European Court of Justice. It doesn't want free movement. It doesn't want to pay into the budget. It wants to be able to set its own market standards. It doesn't want to have to pay attention to EU consumer standards, EU safety standards, EU environmental standards. Judge for yourself whether that's a good or a bad thing. So, you can't have a Norway style option then. Okay, you worked your way down. Maybe if you were willing to accept financial contribution, you could go. Essentially, the last one that's the problem is independent trade policy. This is the real sticking point, because trade really is referring to customs checks. Now, you can have one of the 3 following situations. You can have no customs checks between the UK and the EU. You can have customs checks between the UK and the EU at the Irish border. You can have customs checks within the UK between GB and NI, and none at the Irish border. You have to have one of them. Like, there's no alternate state where somehow customs has no arrangement. You've got to have a border somewhere or an agreement to get rid of that border. And this has been the circle that can't be squared. The idea that you could have some technical solution that by magic allows there to be no hard border in Ireland and no border between Northern Ireland and GB, and still this desire to have independent trade policy is just a unicorn. And I really wonder about these Conservative MPs, the desire to have the independent trade policy. They want to be out of a customs union. They want to be off making trade deals around the world. I think they have, this is me definitely going to step across into a partisan position, I warn you. I think they have this perception of negotiating trade deals as being landing in some foreign country and opening a suitcase and selling like £3 billion worth of British steel. And maybe that would have been the case in the 1970s before they privatized British steel. But nowadays, the role for government in situations like this isn't to sell the steel. The private companies will do that. It's to go around the world meeting and hammering out the lengthy technical details for the reciprocal recognition standard for tariff exemption on a type B3 widget, which is a lot less glamorous. But they are wedded to this idea of not being in any kind of customs union. And this is a problem. This has caused the party system at Westminster to split. This is a network analysis from The Guardian. And you have a split in the Conservatives between those that are broadly willing to accept the leadership and those that are taking a hard line, no deal, no customs union position. And up here you have the Labour whip, Labour Party broadly supportive of some kind of exit deal. And then the backbench rebels from the Labour Party, the Scottish Nationalists, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, Plaid Cymru, that stand as Europhiles that want to continue the relationship with the European Union as close to full membership as possible. We are now in a situation where the Conservative and Labour whips are negotiating with each other because the Conservatives have failed to reconcile their own differences. The voting splits in the UK Parliament are unprecedented. This might look normal if it's 1990s in the US Congress. Believe me, this has never been seen before. And the problem is not that there are so many deals, it's that no one is willing to take their second best. And as a result, a few deals might get to 200 MPs, but nothing is able to carry a majority in the House. And as a result, Theresa May has set an unfortunate record for the fastest trajectory of government resignations ever. She was, you know, in competition with Gordon Brown for a little while, but I think there's actually been 2 since this chart was made. So this is essentially 12 MPs have walked out of the 2 main parties over this. There is blood on the carpet. Even if there isn't a party split, the parties are divided internally like they've only been before on things like the Great Depression, Irish Home Rule, or the Corn Laws in the 19th century. So deal or no deal? Well, 160 MPs voted for no deal. They voted for all of the medical recognition standards stopping and medicines not being able to come in. They voted for planes being grounded because Britain wasn't part of the international agreement on aviation. They voted for all of these things because they want to leave. So if I was to make a prediction, I think the UK leaves the EU but stays in customs union, probably on some kind of rickety, fragile deal between the 2-party front benches at Westminster. But there's no way I'm not caveating that with the possibility that it could all fall apart. Where is Scotland? I think we end up, in the event of a no deal, with another independence referendum. But regardless, Scottish politics continues to be defined by nationalism versus unionism. Northern Ireland, I defer to the greater experts in the room, but my take is that the Northern Ireland Act requires a border poll if it seems likely that Ireland might vote for unification, means one is going to happen. And it may be in the short term, it may be in the medium term, but it is hard to see any outcome of Brexit that does not result in a referendum in Northern Ireland. And I think that result is unpredictable at this point. Brexit has shown the ability of Northern Ireland voters to move away from the old sectarian headcount, where a constituency was decided by whether there were more Catholics or more Protestants. There is especially a young, liberal, cosmopolitan group of Protestants in Northern Ireland who would in the past have been natural unionists, who are, like their equivalents in Britain, appalled by this process. And while there is no party at this point that really is mobilizing them, they are there for the taking. And Scotland will continue to look at Ireland. I've not put Ireland up there. I mean, Ireland is going to get well served by the EU. Scotland is going to continue looking at Ireland with envy, with more envy. And yeah, in my case, definitely a lot more envy. Because Ireland had its bad time. It didn't give up its independence. It gave up its government and got a new one. And that is a lesson that I want people in Scotland to pick up on. Though perhaps I'm not totally confident that they will do so. So, thank you. If you have any questions, I'm sure there will be a few. I could not possibly hope to cover the entire topic, even if I had twice the amount of time. So I will hand over to Sarah to compare.
Thank you very much, Marco, for that fascinating, very extremely enlightening talk. Okay, so we'll take questions. Questions from, we'll take students first. There's Mike.
Yeah, I just had a question about one of the articles that I read on The Guardian was about Britain's reputation throughout Europe to successfully negotiate anything with the EU. And what this exposed was that they don't seem to even be completely familiar with all the treaties that they have signed on to over the last 60 years or 50 years. What kind of damage has this done to their reputation? Because, I mean, just for me, as somebody who knows very little about it, it's hard to imagine that this country now can't seem to run an island ran the world at some point.
Yeah. Do you want to take a few, or shall I just answer that?
It's up to you. I can take a three and you can collect them.
Yeah, if there's
okay,
more.
Great. We'll take another couple.
Hi. I was wondering, this wasn't mentioned, but considering the front benches are doing some talks right now, I'm surprised you didn't factor in the potential for a second referendum to be held as a caveat to accepting a cross-party deal as well. So they would vote and they would also say, okay, and then we'll put it up to a public vote. Whether that includes remaining on the ballot is another question that I guess I would add to that. But I was just wondering if that might see some potential as well.
Yep.
We've got one at the back from Sylvia.
Yeah, I was just hoping you could comment a little bit more on the coalition between the Conservatives and the DUP. What sort of impact the DUP's political process
Yeah,
had?
fair. Okay. Britain has never been terribly popular in the European Union. Like Margaret Thatcher used to show up and handbag people for the domestic audience. She secured a large rebate from the European Union budget as a result. But after expansion, that changed a bit. Britain often found itself allied with the eastern states in European Council, arguing against sort of Franco-German ever closer union. All of that goodwill is gone. Like, there is no goodwill left. I mean, the sheer willingness of the likes of Juncker to stick two fingers up to the UK government is illustrated by their willingness to meet Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. Like, if you respect a country, you don't meet the governor of a rebel province within it that wants to secede and give them status by having that meeting for the public. And in 2014, Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond could not get the time of day from the European institutions. Now it is fated. So that is one indicator. More broadly, you know, you get all of these anonymous sources coming out. Some people in Brussels that are saying things like, you know, from Macbeth, better if it were done, better 'twere done quickly. You know, put them out of their misery, deliver the coup de grace, and just go. To be fair, I think a few voters are thinking that in the UK as well. But yes, any goodwill the UK has had is entirely gone, and the reputation for being able to actually achieve things has taken a serious hit as well. I mean, this in itself is a condemnation of British democracy, the inability of the self-described mother of parliaments to be able to organise such a simple thing as a vote to ratify a government deal. Which takes me to the second referendum. Now, confirmatory referendum got 268 votes to be attached to any other deal. A referendum, a second referendum, has gained a lot of support. It has gained, however, only a tentative support from the Labour Party. So Labour Party backbenchers love it because the Labour Party backbenchers want to stay in the EU, and they assume that a referendum would go their way and cancel the whole thing. The Conservatives are absolutely against it for the same reason. But the Labour frontbench is a lot softer on the future relationship than the Labour backbench. Jeremy Corbyn is an old-style moderate Eurosceptic. Like in the 70s, when this vote was held before and Labour was divided, he would very much have been on the anti-European community side. So there's simply one of those interesting accidents of history. You know, another essay question in future generations might be, what would have happened if a different leader had been in place in the Labour Party? But his lack of passion, lack of interest in the second referendum means that there's probably only going to be an introduction of a second referendum into negotiations as a bargaining chip for them to throw away. And meanwhile, the Europhile bloc over there is going to sit and fume even more. And lastly, the DUP. Oh, you know, in 2017, after the general election, when the Conservatives mislaid their majority, they had gone into the election with a 20-point lead in the polls, and then they ended with no overall majority. After that, one of the most popular search terms on Google in the UK became, who are the DUP? Who is Arlene Foster? I actually had a run-in with her myself when I became a minister over aspects of Scottish same-sex marriage law, but there was an objection to applying it in Northern Ireland or applying Northern Ireland law. Anyway, I was suddenly, for this obscure legal run-in by correspondence, being asked by the Today programme to come on and say, what does this show about the DUP? Like, there was an absolute fixation on who this group were. And we've learned who this group were. They are taking the same approach to EU exit negotiations as they have always taken to the Irish peace process. They're saying no to everything. You know, they are necessary for the UK government to stay in power. They helped the UK government see off a vote to remove them. Their votes were critical to prevent the UK government being removed by a Labour confidence motion. And then afterwards, a speech was made in the House of Commons that one commentator characterised as, nice majority you have there. Shame if anything would happen to it. And that wasn't me attempting a Northern Irish accent, I promise. But essentially, there's been an air of threat. You know, if you do anything to annoy the DUP, it doesn't just jeopardize your deal, it jeopardizes your position in government if you're Theresa May. And that has hung over things. They also appear to be unconcerned really about the idea of a hard border. I imagine the DUP would be quite relaxed about additional barriers between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But they are absolutely unwilling to compromise on a border or customs checks in the Irish Sea. And as a result of that, and the justification that provides to the Tory backbenches, Theresa May's withdrawal deal has been voted down now not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. So yes, again, people will look back and wonder what would have happened if she'd got a majority, or indeed she hadn't held the election in 2017 at all.
Mine's very related to that, and it's probably just a footnote, but if the Sinn Féin reps were to break with their stance of refraining from voting, would that have any impact, any real impact on any of this?
They're not refraining from voting, they're refraining from taking an oath of allegiance to the Queen.
I understand,
Yes.
I understand the basis of that.
Yes.
We'll take
Yeah,
a couple
Sinn
of other
Féin.
questions. Seth?
I can't recall if I read it in the Sun or the Mail, but a couple of
Very reputable sources, both of them. The Mail is now being labeled fake news by some apps online for checking sources.
why I'm asking
Ah, okay.
clarification.
Yeah.
A couple of stories they've run on increased military planning for Brexit withdrawal and how the army would be driving trucks and bringing medicine and delivering it. Aspects, anyways, of martial law. Is that realistic, first of all? And if it is, how does that affect Scotland?
Take one more from Rob.
In reference, you mentioned the Catalonian independence movement, and there was a recent opinion article in The Guardian talking about how a lot of these, including Brexit, seem to be leading their population down a blind alley after that, vote takes place and is successful. How would you feel like the Scottish second referendum would be different than like some of those other previous referendums?
So, Sinn Féin, would Sinn Féin have changed any of the votes? Well, purely mechanically, no. There were votes to legislate. There were votes to legislate. Was it yesterday? It's like dog years. Every day feels like 7 years, and it was yesterday. The backbenches legislated a bill through the House of Commons against government opposition in a day. This has never happened. Forget your 1603 precedents. This just has never happened. And it got through by 1 vote at the end. So the opposition's got those numbers. I mean, I don't think Sinn Féin are ever going to do it, but there's not been a strong argument for it. And from the arithmetic, and I've noticed as well, anytime the SNP leader goes on TV to complain about that shared rule aspect and how, we're the 3rd largest party in the UK Parliament, but constantly ignored, Scotland's wishes get ignored, get invited in for a meeting with Theresa May and then you get ignored. Anytime Nicola Sturgeon does an interview like that, Sinn Féin are immediately putting it out as justification for why they don't participate. So, I mean, for them, clearly this entire process has been an advert for why they don't want to be part of this mess.
I understood
Yep.
that they would have diluted the DUP's 10 votes.
Yeah.
Those 10 votes wouldn't have been enough to give May a majority.
May would still have won the confidence vote, though. She won it by 19, but if the 10 had gone the other way, so she would have won it by 12 not 12, 10. But she would still have won it. No, 12, 7. Yes, 7 constituencies. Anyway, right. Martial law. Not quite, but close. The British Army logistics corps, logistics units have been placed on standby. I got a Scottish Government civil servant drunk and managed to get out of him a little bit of an insight into contingency planning in the event of no deal. for the Scottish government with what the Scottish government has, and wouldn't want to say apocalyptic because you kind of imagine zombies walking through the street then, but we're probably as far as you can go in that direction without being in Hollywood. Probable public order issues, shortages. I mean, people in the UK had a snowstorm and went ballistic because they couldn't get bread in the supermarkets a few years ago. Absolute basics will run out very quickly in the event of no deal, simply because of the time it will take and the bottlenecks that it will introduce on the borders. So yes, not only is the army there to provide essential things, is on standby to provide essential things like medicines, but the police are on reserve for this, and there's now a 24-hour-a-day government coordination centre. There's one in Edinburgh for the Scottish government. The UK government put theirs in their nuclear bunker underneath Whitehall, which was not a good message to send, but there we go. And the third question was about blind steps. Yeah, so this has been part of the problem for Brexit, because what was proposed wasn't a fully fleshed out proposal. It was simply leave the European Union. The Scottish and Catalonia, they probably didn't even have the power to give effect to what they were voting on, so it was even more of a leap in the dark. Before the 2014 independence referendum, the Scottish government published a very large tome called Scotland's Future, which set out not just why to support independence, but the policies that the government would put in place for the transition. Now, this became a target-rich environment for opponents, and it used to be the case that because people who oppose Scottish independence are predominantly in favour of leaving the European Union, and very often are the same campaigners, the people who were arguing for leave came back and said, well, you were stupid in the independence movement. You just gave us all of these things to shoot at. We could attack your currency union proposal. We could attack all of these things. We weren't stupid enough to do that. We just went on the simple principle, and look, we got Brexit. Not sure that argument is holding up quite as much in the long term, given that they've kind of got a vote for Brexit and now they've got chaos about what to introduce. Whereas if the Scottish government had won, it had a much more detailed proposal for what to do. And indeed, that proposal has been updated since with expert reports to try and bring it in line with new developments, not least of which was the collapsing price of oil, which has taken away the economic, well, a lot of the easy economic arguments you can make with the public.
Another round of questions? One here?
Just one question about the man on the street in Scotland.
Yeah.
Edinburgh. I mean, what is the, you know, I read the Irish Times, I listen to Irish
Yeah.
news channels and stuff. I know what the man on the street in Ireland thinks about Brexit. What does the man on the street in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in Glasgow, and in Aberdeen think about Brexit?
Take a couple more.
I wanted to ask about the ERG.
Yeah.
And what you, putting yourself into their shoes, think that their long con is in all this, because they can't make up their mind about anything. They don't want Theresa May, but they'll keep her in government. She offers to resign, they don't accept that. What are they hoping, say they get no deal, which is pretty sure the only thing we know that they want. What's left for them after that? Are they hoping that they get a Eurosceptic PM after May? What about these trade deals? You know, even assuming that they can maintain majorities in elections.
And do we have one more final question?
There's one.
Yeah, well, I was interested in your prediction, and I kind of wanted to know if you had, like, an alternate prediction for the UK, and you're not saying
Okay.
And we'll squeeze in one last
Yeah.
one from yourself.
I saw the slide where you showed how much pain
Yes.
each country will feel. Do you have something that reflects May's view? We don't hear
Ah,
big
mhm,
views. What
mhm,
is May's view that's so much?
Okay. Right. I'm losing my track now. I'm getting to that point where my blood sugar is low. Let's start with that one. So there is another graph out there. I couldn't find it. It's one of those things, you see so many and then you mentally note that you want to get it. So I got this one instead. All deals to leave the EU by any economic modelling show losses for everybody. Right? There's no doubt about that. For the typical person who supports leave, then it's kind of a price worth paying to them. They think, you know, we will suffer a little bit, but we'll get our country back. That's the typical leave mindset. And that is reflected in the UK government. The problem with May's deal in particular is the provision to square that circle that I mentioned before of you have to have either no customs boundaries or a customs boundary in Ireland or between Ireland and Britain. Her deal has an agreement to have no customs union or no customs at all, and therefore no independent trade policy, or failing that, the border between GB and NI. And that backstop, the fallback position, is absolutely unthinkable to the DUP, and they are never going to support the deal as a result. They are not going to countenance the idea of customs checks at Belfast to sail across to Liverpool. They just will not do that. And that is why they have voted against, and they are never changing their view on that deal. The ERG types have, however, slowly softened on it and are starting to be willing to vote for something that looks like a customs union, because I think they're starting to recognize that it may be the only way to get Brexit at all. But, I mean, these are not natural compromisers. You know, 160 of them have voted saying that no deal is fine. No deal that would lead to the worst social unrest of any country in Europe in, well, maybe with the partial exception of Greece in the middle of the financial crisis that anybody has seen. Like, and then all bets are off. You know, parties could split. You could have something like the Irish political upheaval of 2011. You could have any of these things. And 160 Tories are willing to take that chance. And I mean, I'm a nationalist in a different way. I want Scotland to be an independent country in the EU. So I try and apply my perspective to them to try and understand. Like, I can just about see that whole, a little economic hit is worth paying for a country. That was the Quebec argument in 1995. You can have your own country and it'll cost you less than a crate of beer a month. But they do seem to have taken it so far that I worry how much they're up on a lot of the details. There was talk of a tutorial being held in Westminster on a drop-in basis to teach people about the customs union and what it actually entailed. People that had already voted against it 3 times, needing a teach-in to understand it. So the ERG are really hard to work out, and I mean, they are essentially this group here. If this was a game of poker, then they've kind of been called, because the Conservative front bench is now negotiating with the Labour front bench, and they're saying, do your worst. Whether this is a sincere negotiation between these 2 groups or whether it's a tactic to try and bring them back to the table remains to be seen. But it's that kind of brinksmanship that will decide whether we have a deal or no deal in the end. And what does the average person in the street of Edinburgh think? They want it to be over. They really want it to be over. This has consumed all of our media, all of our political bandwidth for 3 years now. There are so many other things. There were protesters at the House of Commons that wandered in, took all their clothes off, and were protesting for climate change. That barely got any coverage. No pun intended. You know, one thing that is certain is the typical person in Scotland has drifted further away from the idea of having another referendum on independence. Because after referendum on independence, multiple elections, referendum on Brexit, I think people want things to calm down for a little while. That said, it's very febrile. That can change very quickly, especially if consequences start to emerge. There's another chart that I didn't put in, which is the trajectory of Britain economically since the referendum, and a trajectory, sort of projected trajectory of what would have happened economically if Britain hadn't voted to leave. And there's a gap opening up. But right now, for most people, any kind of actual tangible impact is foregone advantage. Like, so, you know, the economy hasn't grown as quickly as it might otherwise have. But no deal would result in a very sharp and actual cut. It would result in chaos. It would result in about a 4% cut to the GDP by that analysis, and others have gone higher, up to 8, even 10%. I mean, 10% of the Scottish GDP is £14 billion. That's what, almost $20 billion wiped off in a year. That's a depression level event, but it still seems something intangible, unreal. Right now, people want it over with, and they're trusting leaders to find some kind of resolution. I mean, it used to be that in America, it was classic that your congressperson had a high approval rating and Congress had a low one. While the UK right now is really taking that to extremes. If you ask now who you think would make the best Prime Minister, Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn, the winner by a runaway margin is don't know. Theresa May is getting about 25% support. Jeremy Corbyn isn't even breaking 20. All the rest are don't knows. That is the current state of confidence in the political leadership class in the UK. So yeah, if the rest of the EU thinks the UK can't organise anything, the UK voters seem to agree. Did I answer all of them? Was there another one? I think I did. Okay, excellent. Well, catch me afterwards if I didn't answer anything.